Yesterday's verdict in the state criminal trial does not address potentially systemic policing issues in Minneapolis. Today, I am announcing that the Justice Department has opened a civil investigation to determine whether the Minneapolis Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing.
Less than 24 hours in the United States Justice Department announcing a sweeping investigation into the police practices in Minneapolis. Federal officials are already looking into whether Derek Chauvin and the other officers involved in George Floyd's death violated his civil rights. Iowans continued to process the verdict, including black state leaders. Local 5's Elias Johnson hears from one of them tonight about how far we still have to go.
Did you get a sense of that at first? There was that, you felt like the justice system worked, but then the sadness of, look what got us to this point.
Well, I think it's all those things. I think you add in on top of those factors, the fact that it did feel like, justice being served, in this sense anyway, felt like a team scoring a touchdown. Mm-hmm. It felt like a victory when our criminal justice system is one that's designed, at least in theory, that it's supposed to apply justice. It's supposed to apply righteousness to these situations. And so when we see it happen few and far between, it feels like that. And so for me, that's the conflict that exists. Is this shouldn't be a one-off instance. This should be a normal thing that we get to experience, and there shouldn't be so much elation when justice is served. That should be the norm, not the exception. And so I think that's a lot of the conflict that I had, and I know a lot of other folks as well.
When you look at law enforcement in a holistic approach, what are your viewpoints?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to listen and have conversation. One of my best friends, the father-in-law or godfather of my children, is in law enforcement, and oftentimes he talks about his most feared interactions are those when he comes upon someone who may be suffering from a brain health episode, right? And if that's 40% of what his job is, he's not equipped to deal with that and doesn't want to have to deal with that either. He prefers to somebody who's trained to do that. And so I think that's a great place to start. We've seen communities across our state adding brain health professionals alongside law enforcement to address some of these issues. But I think when we look at the overarching plan, I was told some years back during one of our trainings in Waterloo that it's God, the police, and everybody else. That can't be the mindset that we have when we send individuals into our communities who are geared with making sure that we're all safe in an equitable manner. And so I think it starts with seeking to understand, right, what it looks like to be in a community of color, what it looks like to be in a community of underserved individuals where the socioeconomic status is considered low, and how you interact with those communities, but also the field is changing. And law enforcement seems to be open to that change. It's the elected officials that are oftentimes being the roadblock. And so when I say we need to listen, we need to take into consideration, right, the recommendations that they made to the governor and her task force and apply those things as necessary.
You heard Representative Smith mention the Back the Blue bill making its way through the State House. Among other things, it would increase protections for police and put in higher penalties for protesters. Governor Reynolds proposed the bill, and she wanted a ban on racial profiling in it. Lawmakers took that part out. The governor addressing the issue in today's press conference.
We're going to continue to advocate for those important issues that I put forward in my policy. I'm proud again that we were able to pass the More Perfect Union bill last year. We did that by both parties coming together. It was unanimous. It was really instilled sensible policy reforms. It addressed to training and accountability, so we made really good steps from that. It was supported both by law enforcement and civil rights organizations.
The More Perfect Union bill the governor is talking about passed just weeks after the protests in downtown Des Moines over George Floyd's death in the summer of 2020. Democrats repeatedly said at the time the bill was a good start to address racial disparities in Iowa. Let's talk about what happens with Derek Chauvin next. Some three big things to know. Chauvin's sentencing will be in 8 weeks. That is normal in Minnesota. It'll be a judge, not a jury, deciding how much time he will spend in prison. And something interesting here, the prosecution will be filing with the court a request for an enhancement on his sentence. A legal expert in Minnesota tells us what that means.
They're looking for a departure from the sentencing guidelines. And to do that, they have to prove there are aggravating circumstances. And they've laid out 5 aggravating circumstances. If he finds aggravating circumstances present, and it's, to me, in my mind, that'll be an easy task, frankly, he can then impose up to double the presumptive sentence. So that means he can pose up to 30 years in prison.
Some other parts of sentencing you should know about in the Chauvin case. Chauvin will only face prison time for the first count, third-degree murder. In Minnesota, anyone convicted of a felony only has to serve 2/3 of their sentence. And lastly, Chauvin will be a convicted felon when he gets out of prison, unless he wins any appeals. Tonight, our team is digging into how often we see police officers go behind bars for charges they face while on the job. Local 5's Lakin McKee reports tonight.
Eric Garner was 43 years old when he died in July 2014 in New York City. A white officer placed him in a chokehold when Garner refused to be handcuffed for allegedly selling untaxed cigarettes. A jury declined to indict the officer. The same year, Michael Brown was shot by a white officer, Darren Wilson, in Ferguson, Missouri. Protests erupted shortly after. In this case as well, a grand jury didn't indict Wilson in Brown's death. Another high-profile case, 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Tamir had a pellet gun tucked in his waistband when he was shot by a white Cleveland officer. A jury didn't bring charges against the officer in that case either. We have an extensive list on our website, weareiowa.com, of more police officer-involved killings. I'm Lakin McGee, Local 5 News. We are Iowa.